Look, I need to tell someone about this, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around how insane my husband got over literally nothing. I'm Haley. I'm 33, and I've been married to Paul for 6 years now. 6 years of what I thought was a pretty good marriage until he completely lost his mind over me being friendly at our own house party. So here's the thing about Paul. When I met him, he was this fun, spontaneous guy who knew how to have a good time. He was always the life of the party, always down for whatever. And honestly, that's what I fell for. But somewhere along the way, especially after we got married, he turned into this uptight, controlling person who acts like he's my father instead of my husband. It's like he decided he needed to become some perfect, responsible husband, and now he expects me to transform into this boring housewife version of myself. I work in customer relations, and Paul does something with logistics. Honestly, his job is as boring as he's become. But anyway, we were planning this Super Bowl party at our house, something I'd been looking forward to for weeks. I love hosting, I love having people over, I love the energy of a good party. Paul? He just complains about the mess we'll have to clean up and how much money we're spending on food and drinks. Like, we can afford it, and it's one day a year. But he acts like I'm trying to bankrupt us. Every time I brought up party planning, Paul would make these little comments about keeping things under control and not going overboard. When I bought extra alcohol, he gave me this look like I was planning some kind of rager instead of having friends over to watch football. And don't even get me started on his comments about my drinking. The man acts like I'm some kind of alcoholic just because I like to have a few drinks when I'm socializing. I'm a grown woman. I can handle my alcohol just fine. The morning of the party, I started getting things ready early, and yeah, I had a mimosa while I was setting up. Sue me. It's a party day, I'm excited, and I want to be in a good mood when people arrive. But Paul sees my drink and immediately starts with his disapproving looks and subtle comments about pacing myself. I told him to relax and stop treating me like a child, and he got all defensive, saying he just wants me to have a good time. But his version of me having a good time apparently means sitting quietly in the corner nursing one beer all day. Our friend group was coming over. Mainly people we've known for years, including my best friend Sierra and her boyfriend Nate. Now, Nate is actually fun to be around, unlike some people in my house. He laughs at my jokes, he doesn't act like I'm doing something wrong when I'm being social, and he knows how to keep a conversation going. Sierra's lucky she found someone who doesn't try to change her or police her every move. When Paul suggested I slow down on the drinks before people even arrived, I snapped. I reminded him that at least I'm not doing what he used to do at parties back in the day. Because let's be real, Paul used to be a complete mess at parties, drinking way too much, flirting with other women, staying out until 4 a.m. without even texting me. But now that he's decided to be Mr. Perfect Husband, suddenly I'm the problem for wanting to have fun at my own party. He got all quiet and hurt when I brought up his past, which is exactly what he does when he knows I'm right. He can't handle being reminded that he's not some saint who's always been the perfect partner. I wasn't trying to hurt him, I was just pointing out the hypocrisy of him judging me when his track record isn't exactly spotless. People started arriving and I immediately felt better. This is what I live for, having friends over, everyone laughing and talking, good energy flowing through the house. I'm naturally social, I love making people feel welcome, and I'm good at it. Paul just kind of hovers around looking uncomfortable, like he's chaperoning a high school dance instead of enjoying time with our friends. I could feel him watching me, counting my drinks, monitoring my conversations. It's so embarrassing being married to someone who treats you like you can't be trusted. I'm talking to people, making sure everyone has what they need, being a good hostess, and he's over there giving me looks like I'm doing something inappropriate. The game started and everyone settled in around our living room. I love this part, when everyone's comfortable and relaxed and just enjoying themselves. This is exactly the kind of life I want to live, surrounded by friends and good vibes. But I can see Paul sitting there all tense, like he's waiting for me to do something wrong so he can swoop in and correct me. I had maybe 3 drinks at this point, which for a full day of partying is absolutely nothing. But Paul's acting like I'm stumbling around drunk. I know my limits. I've been drinking socially for over a decade, and I don't need my husband babysitting me at my own party. The fact that he thinks he needs to monitor me like this just shows how little respect he has for me as an adult woman. Sierra was in the kitchen grabbing snacks, and I went over to hang out with Nate on the couch. We were talking about work stuff, just normal conversation, and I was feeling relaxed and social. There was technically an empty spot next to him on the couch, but honestly, sitting on his lap seemed more fun and playful. It's not like it meant anything. We've all been friends for years, and I'm not some uptight person who thinks casual physical contact is automatically sexual. The second I sat down, I could practically feel Paul's eyes burning into me from across the room. I knew exactly what was going through his mind, his jealous, insecure, controlling mind that turns every innocent interaction into some kind of threat. It's exhausting being married to someone who sees problems where there aren't any. Sure enough, within like 30 seconds, Paul appears next to us with this fake smile plastered on his face. He tells me, in front of everyone, that maybe I should sit on the actual seat next to Nate instead. The way he said it, like he's correcting a child who doesn't know better, made my blood boil. He just embarrassed me in front of our friends over absolutely nothing. I got up because I didn't want to make a scene and ruin everyone's good time, but I was furious. How dare he treat me like that? How dare he make me look bad in front of people because of his own insecurity issues? I spent the rest of the party trying to act normal, but I could feel everyone's eyes on me, wondering what that was about. Paul kept giving me these pointed looks for the rest of the afternoon, like he was keeping score of every little thing I did. It's impossible to relax and enjoy yourself when someone's constantly monitoring your behavior and waiting for you to slip up. I felt like I was walking on eggshells at my own party, in my own house. When people started leaving, I knew Paul was gearing up for one of his lectures. I could see it in his face. That self-righteous expression he gets when he thinks he's about to teach me some important lesson about appropriate behavior. As if I'm the one who needs lessons, when he's the one who can't handle his wife being social and friendly. As Nate and Sierra were getting ready to leave, Paul cornered us by the front door. He started going on about how what I did was inappropriate, and how as a married woman I shouldn't have done that. I wanted to die of embarrassment. Here he is, lecturing me and Nate like we're teenagers who got caught making out instead of adults who had a completely innocent interaction. Both Nate and I apologized just to get Paul to shut up and let our friends leave without more drama. But I could see in Paul's face that he wasn't satisfied with our apologies. Nothing is ever enough for him when he gets like this. He wants me to grovel and admit I was completely wrong and promise to never do anything like it again. After everyone left, Paul immediately started in on me about respect and boundaries and how my behavior reflects on both of us. I couldn't believe he was making such a huge deal out of sitting on someone's lap for literally 2 seconds. I pointed out that Sierra didn't care, Nate didn't care. Nobody cared except him and his paranoid imagination. When he said my actions made him look bad, I lost it. I told him exactly what he is, insecure and controlling. Because that's the truth. A secure man wouldn't see a threat in his wife sitting on their friend's lap for a few seconds during a casual party. A secure man would trust his wife and not immediately assume the worst about every interaction she has with other men. The fight escalated from there, with Paul going on and on about how I don't respect him or our marriage. So I reminded him about all the disrespectful things he used to do when we were dating, staying out all night, flirting with other women, coming home drunk and expecting me to take care of him. At least I've never actually crossed any real lines like he has. I told him I would never care if one of my friends sat on his lap because I'm not a jealous, paranoid person. I trust him, and I expect the same trust in return. But apparently that's too much to ask from someone who sees every male friend as a potential threat to our marriage. We went to bed angry, and I lay there thinking about how exhausting it is being married to someone who polices every little thing I do. I can't be myself. I can't be social. I can't have fun without him finding something wrong with it. This isn't the marriage I signed up for, and it definitely isn't the man I fell in love with. The next morning, Paul was still acting all wounded and dramatic, giving me the silent treatment like I'd actually done something wrong. I decided to be the bigger person and apologize, not because I thought I'd done anything inappropriate, but because living with his sulking and passive-aggressive behavior was getting old fast. I gave him what I thought was a perfectly reasonable apology. I acknowledged that maybe sitting on Nate's lap wasn't the best choice, and I said I was sorry if it made him uncomfortable. But apparently, that wasn't enough for Paul. He wanted me to understand why it bothered him so much. He wanted me to validate his feelings. He wanted to turn the whole thing into some deep emotional discussion about respect and boundaries. This is classic Paul. He can't just accept an apology and move on. Everything has to be a teaching moment. Everything has to be analyzed and discussed until I'm completely exhausted and just want the conversation to end. Why can't he just be satisfied that I apologized and let it go? A few days later, I was talking to Sierra about the whole thing, and she confirmed what I already knew. It really wasn't that big of a deal, and Paul totally overreacted. Sierra said she didn't think anything of it when it happened, and she was right there. If anyone should have been bothered by it, it should have been her, not my paranoid husband. But when I mentioned to Paul that Sierra agreed he'd overreacted, suddenly I was making him the villain and dismissing his feelings. I can't win with this man. When I try to show him that other people think he's being unreasonable, he acts like I'm ganging up on him. When I try to explain my perspective, he says I'm not listening to his concerns. Nothing I do is ever right. I'm starting to realize that no matter what I do, it's never enough for Paul. He's always finding something to criticize, or some way I'm falling short of his impossible standards. I used to think he loved me for who I am, but now I'm seeing that he loves some idealized version of me that doesn't actually exist. When Paul brought up the incident again a few days later, I snapped. I told him I was tired of being made to feel guilty for being social and friendly. I pointed out that this constant criticism and judgment is exactly why I need to drink sometimes. Being around his negativity is stressful and exhausting. I started questioning whether my memory of the event was even accurate anymore. Paul kept insisting I'd sat on Nate's lap for way longer than I remembered, and that Nate had looked uncomfortable. But that's not how I remembered it at all. I remembered it being a quick, playful moment that lasted maybe 30 seconds tops. When I tried to correct Paul's version of events, he got even more upset and started accusing me of gaslighting him. Can you believe that? He's the one trying to rewrite history to make me look bad, but somehow I'm the one gaslighting him. This is exactly the kind of twisted logic I'm dealing with. I started to wonder if Paul was already looking for reasons to be upset with me that night. Maybe he'd decided before the party even started that I was going to do something wrong. So when I sat on Nate's lap, it confirmed what he was already thinking. That would explain why he reacted so strongly to something so innocent. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this fight wasn't really about respect or boundaries. It was about Paul's trust issues and insecurity. Maybe he's projecting his own guilt about his past behavior onto innocent situations. Maybe he assumes I'm capable of the same kind of disrespectful behavior he used to engage in. When I suggested this to Paul, he got defensive and accused me of attacking him for trying to understand his perspective. But I wasn't attacking him. I was trying to get to the root of why he's so paranoid about my interactions with other men. If he's going to psychoanalyze my behavior, then I should be allowed to do the same with his. I started keeping track of all the ways Paul had been unsupportive lately. Criticizing my drinking, embarrassing me in front of friends, always assuming the worst about my intentions, never giving me the benefit of the doubt. The list was getting pretty long, and it made me question whether I even wanted to be married to someone who clearly doesn't trust me. Every conversation we had became an opportunity for me to point out his controlling behavior and double standards. When he'd bring up the lap incident, I'd counter with examples of his past mistakes. When he'd criticize my drinking, I'd remind him of all the times he'd come home wasted. Two can play this game. By the end of that week, I was completely convinced that I was the victim in this whole situation. Paul's jealousy and controlling behavior was the real issue in our marriage, not my innocent interaction with a friend. I started questioning whether I'd made a mistake marrying someone who fundamentally doesn't understand or appreciate who I am as a person. Things got even worse when I found out Paul had been talking to his friends about our fight. Sierra mentioned that Paul had asked Nate privately if he was uncomfortable with what happened at the party. I couldn't believe it. He was going behind my back to build his case instead of just trusting my word that it was innocent. When I confronted Paul about it, he tried to say he was just trying to understand the situation better, but I knew what he was really doing. He was trying to get validation that I was wrong. He was shopping around for people to tell him that his reaction was justified and that I'd crossed a line. The fact that Nate apparently told him he was a little surprised by it just proved that men stick together. Of course, Nate wasn't going to tell Paul it was no big deal. He probably felt awkward being put in the middle of our marital problems and just told Paul what he wanted to hear. I started checking Paul's phone and social media more carefully. Not because I didn't trust him exactly, but because I needed to know if he was talking about our personal business with other people. Our marriage problems should stay between us, not become gossip material for his friends. Sure enough, I found text messages with his buddies where he was definitely complaining about me. He used words like disrespectful and boundary issues when describing what happened. He was literally trying to turn our mutual friends against me by making me sound like some kind of inappropriate wife who can't be trusted around other men. When I confronted him with the evidence from his phone, he had the nerve to get mad at me for going through his messages. He completely missed the point that he was the one betraying our marriage by airing our dirty laundry to his friends. His violation of our privacy was way worse than me checking up on him. The fights became a daily occurrence after that. Paul constantly bringing up respect and boundaries while I pointed out his hypocrisy and controlling behavior. I started documenting every time he dismissed my feelings or made me feel bad about myself. If he wanted to keep score, I could keep score too. During one particularly heated argument, I told him that maybe the problem wasn't me sitting on someone's lap. Maybe the problem was that I married someone who doesn't trust me and treats me like his property instead of his partner. That really set him off, but it needed to be said. I brought up how much fun I used to have before I got married, how social and carefree I was, and how he'd been slowly trying to change me into his version of the perfect wife. I used to go out with friends without getting the third degree. I used to be able to have a few drinks without someone monitoring my intake. I used to be able to be myself without constant criticism. When Paul tried to deny that he was trying to change me, I pointed out all the ways he'd criticized me over the years. My drinking, my friends, my need for social interaction, my outgoing personality. Apparently, everything about me needed to be toned down or controlled in some way. I realized that this fight wasn't really about the lap sitting at all. It was about the fact that we'd grown into completely different people who wanted different things from life. I wanted someone who supported me and let me be myself. He wanted someone who followed his rules and made him feel secure about his masculinity. The breaking point came a few weeks later when we went to Sierra's birthday dinner at this nice restaurant downtown. I was determined to prove that I could be social and appropriate at the same time, but Paul was watching me like a hawk, monitoring every interaction I had with the men in our friend group. When an old mutual friend from college showed up and gave me a completely normal hug, "Hello?" I saw Paul's jaw tighten from across the room. That's when I realized I was done pretending everything was fine between us. I was done walking on eggshells and modifying my behavior to manage his insecurities. I made a point of being extra friendly and affectionate with everyone that night. Not because I was trying to be inappropriate, but because I refused to let Paul's paranoia control how I interacted with people. If he wanted to see problems where there weren't any, then let him drive himself crazy doing it. When we got home that night, Paul started another one of his lectures about my behavior at dinner. He said I was being too touchy and sending the wrong signals, to our male friends. I finally exploded and told him I was tired of being married to someone who didn't like who I actually was. I told him I was tired of pretending that his jealousy and control issues were somehow my fault. I was tired of apologizing for being a social, friendly person just because it made him uncomfortable. I was tired of having to defend every interaction I had with another human being. The fight went nuclear when I told him that maybe I should have married someone like Nate, who knows how to have fun and doesn't turn every social situation into a moral crisis. That was probably a low blow, but I was past caring about his feelings at that point. Paul completely lost it and told me that if I wanted to act single, maybe I should be single. Instead of backing down like I usually did when he threatened me with divorce, I agreed with him. I told him that maybe divorce was exactly what we both needed. I started sleeping in the guest room that night, and we barely spoke for the next few days. During that time, my mind went to some dark places. I started thinking about what I could have had if I hadn't settled down so young, what kind of life I'd be living if I wasn't tied to someone who clearly didn't appreciate me. I began planning what my life would look like without Paul. The freedom to be myself without constant criticism. The ability to have friends over without getting permission. The option to go out for drinks after work without having to justify it to someone. It actually sounded pretty appealing. I reached out to old friends I hadn't talked to in years, people from before I got married who knew the real me. The fun, social, carefree version of myself that Paul had slowly been suffocating over the past 6 years. Maybe it was time to get that person back. When Paul tried to initiate conversations about working things out, I shut him down. I was done talking about his feelings and his boundaries and his need for respect. What about my needs? What about my happiness? What about my right to be myself in my own marriage? I started looking at apartments online and fantasizing about living alone again, being able to have people over without permission. Drinking when I wanted to without judgment, making my own decisions without having to consider how they'd affect someone else's fragile ego. 3 months later, I was living in this tiny studio apartment that cost almost twice what we'd been paying for our mortgage. But I told myself it was worth it for the freedom. The divorce had been messy. Paul fought me on everything, trying to make me look like the bad guy when he was the one who couldn't handle being married to an independent woman. I had to get a second part-time job to afford my new lifestyle, which was exhausting, but at least I didn't have to answer to anyone anymore. No one was monitoring my drinking or questioning my choices or making me feel guilty for being myself. The hardest part was how our friend group basically chose sides, and most of them chose Paul. Sierra still talked to me, but it was different now. Awkward and careful, like she was walking on eggshells around me. I guess Paul's campaign to make me look like the bad wife had been more successful than I'd realized. It hurt seeing our mutual friends post pictures from parties and gatherings that I wasn't invited to anymore. These were people I'd considered close friends, but apparently their loyalty was to Paul, not to me. It made me realize how fake some of those friendships had been. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I found out through Facebook that Paul was already dating someone new. Some quiet, bookish type who probably let him control every aspect of her life. Seeing their photos together made my stomach turn, not because I wanted him back, but because it proved he'd never really loved me for who I was. He'd probably found himself a nice, submissive woman who would follow his rules and never challenge him or make him feel insecure. Someone who would sit quietly at parties and never draw attention to herself. Everything I could never be, and honestly, everything I never wanted to be. The worst part was seeing how happy he looked in those photos. Not the stressed, tense version of himself that he'd become during our marriage, but genuinely relaxed and content. It made me wonder if maybe I really had been the problem all along, but I pushed that thought away because it was easier to stay angry. My dating life was a complete disaster. Men my age wanted stability and someone who had their life together, and I was living in a studio apartment working 2 jobs just to make ends up. The ones who were interested in me were usually just looking for something casual, which wasn't what I wanted despite what Paul might have thought. I tried to reconnect with old friends from before my marriage, but most of them had moved on with their lives. They had serious relationships, mortgages, kids, all the adult responsibilities I was running away from. I felt like I was stuck in some weird time warp, trying to recapture a version of myself from 10 years ago. My drinking got worse after the divorce. Not because I was an alcoholic like Paul always claimed, but because starting over at 33 was harder than I'd expected. Some nights, I'd sit in my tiny apartment, drinking wine and scrolling through social media, watching everyone else's perfect lives while mine fell apart. The final devastating blow came almost a year after our divorce, when I saw Paul and his new girlfriend at the grocery store. They were shopping together, looking completely comfortable and domestic, and I could tell she genuinely appreciated him in a way I never had. She laughed at something he said, touched his arm affectionately, looked at him like he was amazing. Watching them together, I had this horrible realization that maybe I really had thrown away something good. Maybe Paul wasn't controlling and insecure. Maybe he was just a man who wanted to feel valued and respected by his wife. Maybe I'd been so focused on defending my right to do whatever I wanted that I'd forgotten about his right to feel secure in our marriage. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I pushed it away. It was easier to blame Paul for being too sensitive than to accept that maybe I'd been selfish and inconsiderate. It was easier to tell myself that we were just incompatible than to admit that I'd chosen my own comfort over his feelings time and time again. My life continued its downward spiral from there. I got evicted from my studio apartment when I couldn't keep up with rent after losing one of my jobs for calling in sick too many times. I had to move back in with my parents at 34 years old, which was humiliating beyond words. Living with my parents again made me feel like a complete failure. Here I was, a grown woman who couldn't even take care of herself, while my ex-husband was building a life with someone who actually deserved him. My mom kept making passive-aggressive comments about how maybe I should have tried harder to make my marriage work. The absolute worst moment came when I found out through Sierra that Paul and his new wife were expecting their first child. A baby. The family I'd always claimed I wanted someday, but had been too selfish and immature to actually work toward when I had the chance. Sitting in my childhood bedroom, looking at the ultrasound photo Sierra had accidentally shown me on her phone, I realized I'd thrown away the chance at the life I'd always said I wanted. I could have been the one having Paul's baby, planning a nursery, building a future together. Instead, I was a divorced woman living with her parents because I couldn't handle someone actually caring about my actions. But even facing this complete collapse of everything I'd thought I wanted, I still couldn't bring myself to admit that maybe I'd been wrong. It was easier to tell myself that Paul had been too controlling, that our friends had been too judgmental, that society expected too much from women in marriage. I convinced myself that I was better off without all those people who couldn't accept me for who I really was. If they wanted to judge me for being independent and refusing to be controlled, then I didn't need them in my life anyway. Paul could have his perfect little wife and his perfect little life. I'd find people who actually appreciated my free spirit. But deep down, in the quiet moments when I was alone in my childhood bedroom, I knew the truth. I'd destroyed my own life because I couldn't handle being held accountable for my actions. I'd chosen my ego over my marriage, my pride over my family, my right to do whatever I wanted over building something meaningful with someone who loved me. And now Paul was living the life we could have had together, just with someone who actually deserved it. Someone who understood that marriage meant considering your partner's feelings, not just your own desires. Someone who knew that love meant putting the relationship above your individual wants sometimes. But I'll never admit that out loud. It's easier to stay angry, to blame everyone else, to convince myself that I'm the victim in this whole situation. Because the alternative, accepting responsibility for destroying my own happiness, is too painful to face.